Hello again, everybody, and this week we're going to talk about body language. Body language is one of those things that we hear as the most prevalent of all lying behaviors. You can look it up online. You can talk to people. They'll say certain things about how crossing your arms and folding your legs over, things like that, are that more prevalent of the lie detection aspects. So we're going to go through some of that. Body language is one of those things where we don't have a lot of different alternatives to body language from a simple form. So again, this is a basic class, so we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about all the different complexities that come with body language, but we are going to talk about the more prevalent stuff that is pretty obvious for most people and what they're looking at. And then we're going to throw some curveballs in there a little bit to try to break up the monotony a little bit, because with body language, we're really looking for, is it truly their deceptive behavior, defensive postures, things like that, or is it just the way they usually sit? Because again, when it comes to body language, people may automatically assume somebody who's crossed their arms is being deceptive, but it could just be that they're crossing their arms because there's other things going on. It could be the inability to be assured of themselves in their answers. It also could be because it's cold inside. I mean, there's multiple reasons why somebody might cross their arms. So when it comes to postures, it's not whether it's deceptive or non-deceptive. It's more about closed and open when it comes to the basic forms of what we're going to talk about this week in this lesson. So as we go through this, understand, just because we're talking about it body language doesn't automatically assume that somebody's being deceptive to us. So one of the big things is body language is the most prevalent of all lying behaviors. Like we said a minute ago, it's one of the most prevalent because it's one of the most obvious of the things that we see out there. So when you meet somebody for the first time, the way that they sit, the way they stand, the way they cross their arms, whatever they're doing, it's obvious because it's such a huge part of the person. It takes up a great distance across the body when it comes to body language. Things we're not going to talk about in this lesson is more of advanced stuff. It's like the way people will shift their bodies away from you when they're ready to end a conversation. We're not talking about trying to establish whether or not someone is done in a conversation or something like that. We know that people and liars sometimes will point their feet towards the door when they're ready to leave. It's a subconscious reaction. What we're talking about this week is just the basic. You walk into a room or you're talking to somebody on the side of the road, and the way they're sitting or standing, we want to look at that from that open versus closed. So some of the stuff I really want people to pay attention to is what are open versus closed stances, sitting styles when it comes to body language. The main thing it says, like here in number 2, is establish a norm before accusing someone of lying. So just because, again, somebody comes in and sits down with their arms crossed, there's multiple reasons why that could happen. I don't know about any of y'all, but if you were ever younger and you ever got pulled into a police department or talking to a police officer, you're already on your defensive because you're talking to somebody who is accusing you or maybe talking to you about something pretty serious. Doesn't mean that you did anything wrong. Maybe you're a witness to something, but still, you're in a police department. Of course, you're going to be defensive in nature to start with because you're somewhere you're not used to being. So it's important to understand that body language does not automatically assume deception. Body language just shows us how comfortable somebody is in that moment. And that's what we really want when it comes to the body language stuff, is how comfortable is somebody talking to us. All right, so here's just a picture of different styles of body language. As we can see, people probably waiting for a job interview, since you've got a couple of people holding applications, it appears. But you can see by looking at the body language, some people feel a little bit more confident, but you've got mostly crossed legs. You've got a little bit of an open stance on the individual on the far left, but for the most part, of course, in a stressful situation, they're getting ready to be interviewed for a job interview, most likely. There's going to be some stress there. And I don't know what kind of job they're applying for, but hopefully it's not any departments where some of them are dressing like that. But nowadays, you never know anymore. But as you can see, arms crossed doesn't mean that somebody is being deceptive. It just means that somebody is closed off because of stress or what other reasons that could be implying. Again, could be temperature in the room. There's all kinds of stuff that can apply. All right, so let's look at some closed stances. So here's some basic closed stances that we can see from individuals. You've got the leg on the far left there. You can see the legs crossed, arms are crossed. That's pretty simple. If you look at that photo, though, that person is very defensive because they're pulled back in that chair. And again, looking at the chair itself makes it a little bit easier to see the body language, because when it comes to us trying to talk to people, swivel chairs are not going to be well for us because they're going to be able to move around and adjust themselves however they want. A small chair like this guy sitting in the far left over here and on the far right is what we're really looking for because it limits the ability to move around. So looking at this picture here on the left, we see arms crossed and legs crossed. We could also add a part of that, which is called shame, where the head's tilted down. But again, that's a more advanced class. But really what we're looking at is the totality of the body language itself. Arms pulled back. You can see the defensive nature of it because he's pulled back in his chair. He's not just crossing his arms. He's stiff-shouldered, which means his arms are pulled back. That's a very uncomfortable situation. If somebody's holding that pose for a long time, there's a lot of stress build up. If we get to an interview and we're talking to somebody and they're sitting like normal arms crossed and then they tense those shoulders up while you ask a hard question, then it could be a problem. There may be something there that needs to be addressed. Again, legs crossed doesn't mean anything by itself, but if we start from an open posture, which we'll look at in a minute, and we go to a closed posture, that's because something's occurring there during that process that somebody might not be comfortable with. The one in the middle there, it's still a closed posture. They call it the thinker pose. See where he's got his hand on his chin. That is a thinker pose from the waist up, but lower body, you've got a leg crossed. It's still considered a closed stance position. And even on the right, where he's kind of smiling, seems pretty confident in what he's, with his hands on his shirt, he's got a smile going. You still see that leg crossed over. That's still going to be closed posture. Again, closed posture, not deceptive posture. We don't talk about posture as a deceptive form. We talk about it from a stance of closed versus open stances. All right, so some open stances. We've got the one on the left there. As you can see, again, it's stock photos. We've got the guy on the left is showing with his, even though he's not sitting in a chair, he's open with his feet. Now his hands are cupped. They are not crossed, if you noticed. His arms are not crossing his body. They're just cupped because of the way he's sitting. He's sitting forward, leaning. And of course, with hands, a lot of people are not going to drop their hands down to their legs because if they do, it causes them to lean too much forward. He's putting his hands on his knees and using his hands. He's collapsing his hands or cusping his hands to make it easier to sit. So that is still considered an open posture. He's not crossing his arms. Now with the one on the second one, the thinker pose up top, he's got his hand on his leg. He's confident in what he's talking about, or he's just processing what he's saying, just like the one on the right. Pretty much the exact same pose. So sometimes we do that, and sometimes the people we're talking to do that. But that is another good thing to point out about as we're talking about this stuff is that we do these poses just as much as somebody else. And we're going to talk about that in a little while of where body language from us as officers can really dictate how that interview is going to go. And I'm going to show you a picture of one that I'm involved in where you could look at and see that I wasn't feeling confident in what was being said, or my body language was telling me that I didn't even want to be in the room. And we'll talk about that here in a little bit. All right, so let's look at what we've got now. All right, so the one on the far left, we're going to start there. Looking at that, we've got feet that are pretty spread out. Legs are open to a degree, and then lean back in the chair. Arms are not crossed. Again, we've got open arms, so we're going to look at that as a open posture. This one might be a little bit trickier, but if you look at it there, you've got an arm that's crossing completely over to the opposite part of the body. Again, not like somebody who's got their hands clasped in front of them. This is a crossover. So anytime you get that crossing, we are going to consider that a closed stance. So one arm, even though it's just one arm, it's still considered closed off to a degree. Again, not deceptive, closed. And then the other one might be a little bit easier there because that leg is obviously crossed over the body, so that's going to be a closed stance as well. All right, so continuing on here, we're looking at postures. Again, closed versus open postures. So on the left here, we've got somebody who's seems pretty confident. She's smiling and sitting in there. Now, just kind of give y'all a heads up, I did not just randomly take pictures of suspects as they were in my interview room. These are some of my former interns who assisted me with some of this. And so as we go through a couple of these photographs, understand that they're just some of my former students. So in the left there, you've got, her name's Brittany, and she's sitting in that posture where seems a pretty easy one to look at and say that that's going to be an open stance. Second you're going to look at is going to be not as much closed off or open. You've got only one thing you got to look at, but those hands there with those hands covering, again, their clasp, that's just somebody kind of sitting naturally. So that's going to be a open stance as well. And then thirdly, what you're looking at is a closed off stance too, because you've got the arms crossed and the feet crossed. Even though she's smiling, you're still looking at a closed off stance. All right, so continuing forward here, looking at this one. Hopefully at this point, looking at some of these, noticing the feet and the hands, you can figure out pretty quick what we have here. That's going to be an open posture. We like to see those postures, those open postures, because somebody feels comfortable and confident in what they're talking about. Here again, this one's a little bit simple in my opinion because what we've talked about so far, so hopefully you're starting to figure these things out. But you're looking at this, and what you're dictating is going to be a closed posture. And then this one might be a little bit more trickier. You know, you've got open feet, which appear to be open feet. The problem you have here is the arms are crossed. And if you really pay attention here with those feet, that's going to change things a little bit because they're not crossing the legs over, but they're covering themselves underneath those chair pedestals. So that's technically covering themselves up to a degree. We're going to call that a closed posture as well. Just take a look at those for a second, kind of determine there and see, understand why each one of those are considered what they are. All right, so let's, as a group, we're going to sit here and judge some of these real quick. So on the far left there, as you see it, you've got closed stance. See the legs crossed. Even though his arms are back, we've got somebody who seems a little bit comfortable to a degree, but still having that leg crossed. The next one, again, seems pretty simple, face value. We've got an open stance in that one. And the next one, even though he's smiling, his legs are crossed and his arms are open, we're still looking at it from that crossover standpoint. So again, we've got another closed posture. So take a moment to look at those for just a second. All right, so far left there, this is a little different. Of course, we look at it for face value. You would say, oh, yeah, that's absolutely an open posture. But if you look at his facial expressions, you look at the way his shoulders are back, almost like he's getting ready to lay down in bed, we call that an aggressive open posture. They see this posture in individuals whenever they're confident in what they're saying. They feel good about themselves. You may be talking about something and they feel like you're going down the wrong path in an interview, and so they don't feel like anything's going to happen from them, so they have no problem sitting that way. They open that style up. They start having this little smirk on their face that we learn in some of our other interview classes. That's that duping delight face that they put on. But in this picture, we're looking at an aggressive open stance. And then the last one's a little bit harder to see from that angle, but if you see that foot crossed over, it's almost like it's laying flat on the ground. It's crossed over that other foot. That's still going to be considered a closed stance. All right, now this is the one that might be a little bit harder for some people to look at and say, oh, that's open or closed. Because technically, we don't want to call this either one. It would be an open stance to a degree, but this is the face of someone that's ready to do the one thing we want, confess. Because you see how they're slumped over towards us, body's lowered down. Again, without having a lengthy amount of time talking about body language, this is what we want from individuals that we're sitting in an interview with, and then they start breaking down with us and start getting to a point where they're accepting what's going on in the room. This is where it's really important for us, and even though we don't spend a lot of time talking about it, getting up there with the person, within a foot of that person, and being right there with them to help them confront whatever they're dealing with. From a passionate standpoint, from a empathy standpoint, we're going to be there with them to try to get them through whatever they're going through. And looking at the hands, even though they're together, you're going to see that we call the guilt rub, where they're starting to rub their hands together. The stress is getting to them, and they're going to start rubbing their hands together because that stress is building up. All right, so when it comes to liars and body language, again, we're looking at physical expressions to be limited. So people will stiffen up. They will limit their body movements because, again, you get online and you start looking it up, people will tell you that's one of the prominent things they can find online is body language. So people try to sometimes stiffen up a little too much because they know that if they don't, or if they get too talkative with their hands, they may process some stuff out there that you see that they're doing that's like, wait a minute, that's not right, the way they're using their hands and stuff. They're being real nervous. So they try to stiffen themselves up to a degree. It also can be that they're trying to keep themselves closed off because they're protecting themselves. You'll see very few arm and hand movements from a lot of people. They won't move their hands around a lot, especially at the beginning. But once they get into this point where they're starting to feel the the heat come onto them, where they start allowing the body to kind of break down a little bit and start noticing that they can let go of certain things, then you'll start seeing those hand movements kind of phase in, kind of like we did on the picture a second ago. Liars also take up less space. It constricts their movements. They start closing themselves off, kind of like that one guy did in the very first pictures that we saw, where he really tightened himself up into a closed ball. When they're really getting into a stressful state, all that comes closing up. They're going to avoid eye contact with you, even though eye contact is not going to be falling under body language itself. It's more of a nonverbal cue. By disassociating their eyes with the person they're talking to, when they look away from the individual, that causes the head to move too, which is body language, because the head's tilting away. And a lot of times they'll look to the floor. Kids are the best when it comes to this. If anybody has kids, or if you ever talk to a child who's lying to you, they will, when they're first learning the ideas of what lying does and how the body works, and they don't understand that their body's doing things on its own when it comes to lying, you talk to a kid, they'll look straight to the ground and answer, yes or no, or lie to you with their head straight to the ground, because, again, they don't want to make that eye contact. They'll touch their face, their throats, and their mouth. They'll cover their mouth a lot of times. You'll get some mumbling, like in the photograph as you see here. You've got some politicians, and you've also got some sports icons here with covering their face up, because, again, it's about their body is fighting the urge to lie, because we learn as a kid lying's wrong. And so when they put their hand in front of their mouth, a lot of times you'll see people mumble. They'll try to protect their words by covering their face, things like that. Again, in the photo, not saying that all three are lying whenever they're talking, but we see that a lot in individuals whenever they do lie. All right, so they become guilty people become defensive. They close off. Innocent become offensive over time. So what happens is you'll get guilty people in body language. They'll recede. They'll become defensive. They'll close themselves off, and they'll stay that way for the most part. Every once in a while, you may see a little aggression where they'll get a little loud, but they stay in that defensive body posture for the most part. Innocent people become more offensive over time. Think about it. If you're being accused of something you know you didn't do, at some point you're going to push back on that. You're going to push against that and be like, no, this is wrong. Stop accusing me of something I didn't do. I'm not going to agree with what you're saying. I'm going to become more open. I'm going to push forward. I may even lean forward against the officer or the detective who's interviewing me, because over time my frustration is going to build up, and I'm not going to let someone accuse me constantly of something I didn't do, knowing I didn't do it. It's different if you know you did it, or you're afraid somebody's going to find out you did it. So innocent people over time, now when I say over time, I can't dictate how long that is, because there's not really, everybody's different. Everybody's fight or flight response is different. But over time, that stuff builds up and causes that innocent person to go on the offensive at some point. Here, like we talked about a little bit earlier, guilty attempt to turn away from the accuser, without going into a lot of different points to this. Guilty bodies will turn their body away from the accuser, and usually towards the door, unless you're in front of the door. They will turn their body away from it. They'll, even out on the side of a highway, if you're working out on the side of the highway and you're talking to somebody, they will eventually shift themselves away from you, whether it be because they're ready to get out of the conversation or they're thinking about running. So if you start seeing people blade their feet away from you, you're in an interview room and people start turning their body towards the door, you start realizing that they're getting ready to get out of that conversation. If anybody's ever been in a conversation with somebody, and as you're talking to the person, you or them start turning your body away from the individual, that's a sign that somebody's probably done with that interview. And so I've tried to make it a point of habit for me that if I'm talking to somebody, and we've been talking a while, and I see their body language show me they're pointing towards the door, pointing away from me, yeah, that's my cue to probably say, yeah, I think we've probably been talking long enough, because you're losing focus at that point. It also says guilty may unconsciously, or even without the intent of, placing objects between themselves and the accuser. They'll put things between you and them, all kinds of different items that we're going to talk about. But they'll put different items, and that's why when some of the pictures I'm going to show you, think about the stuff that you place on the table in front of you when you're talking to somebody, because they're going to put those barriers in front of you. You've already got a table in front of you. Don't let the table have stuff on it that's going to distract them, because truthfully, where you want an interview to be conducted is face-to-face with the person without anything between you. And I'm going to show you a photograph of that here in a little while. So there's physical barriers that we want to get out of the way. So as you can see in the photograph right here, This individual, he's holding something in his lap, like a laptop bag, backpack or something. You don't want to put those physical barriers there. Things like round tables versus square tables. I'm not a big fan of round tables because it feels like you're constantly going around the table with the person. With square tables, they have those corners. So when you turn that corner, that is initial idea for the person to know they're not going to like seek around the backside of the table. Those corners are going to kind of prevent that. We see really neat science in different things like we're seeing now, like even in restaurants and in bars, they don't use squared corners, they use round corners because it's the subconscious psychological ability to turn the corner to talk to somebody without it being sharp. Those sharp corners are like barriers for some reason in our mind, but those round corners that you see in some bars and restaurants, that means it's easy to turn. That's why you see more and more round tables in bars and restaurants now versus square. You also, when it comes to an interview in an interview room, though, those square tables are beneficial because we don't want to have the person feel like they can turn around and keep going around in that circle. We want them to be stable on that side. So I tell people in your interview rooms, don't have round tables. Have square tables and keep those square tables in there. Try to limit the items that you have in there. Try your best not to have a lot on the table. I know some people want to take a notepad and pen, and that's fine. That's great, but those can be distractions as well. To give you a primary story, I was interviewing a lady one time, and she was holding a pen. And she was talking, and she kept waving that pen in front of my face. And I took the pen away from her. After I asked her, I said, "Can I see your pen for a minute?" I said, "I need to write something down on a piece of paper." So I took her pen and I wrote something down on a piece of paper. I put the pen beside me. I turned around and she's holding another pen. And I thought it was a little weird, but it was the exact same pen. And I was like, okay, she's got two of them, not a big deal. We talked for a few minutes. I asked her to write something on a piece of paper. I asked her if I could borrow her pen. I had her to actually do a diagram of a room that she was in at the day of the incident that occurred. I took the pen from her, asked her if I could write something down. She gave me her pen. I wrote something down, put the pen next to me, turned back around, and she's holding another pen. So we went through this 4 times. 4 different times she's holding the exact same pen. And if you watch me in the video at that day, whenever they were showing the video, I was looking around the room like trying to figure out where the pens were coming from like I was being punked by somebody. Because I'm like, how does she keep coming up with these pens? And how is she so smooth about putting them back out there and acting like she never lost one? And she's doing it subconsciously. She's picking up the pen as a barrier because it makes her feel comfortable where she's sitting. That's why I tell people, don't let people hold cell phones if you can help it. Don't let people have hats on their heads. Remove these physical barriers, tissue paper that's on the counter and stuff like that. All that stuff is going to take hold on the individual's barriers, mental barriers, and physical barriers that's going to help them feel like more confident when they're talking to you because they feel protected. So I ended up finding out that lady that I had interviewed had a bucket of pens next to her at the behind me where I couldn't see she had like a little shelf up behind her. And there was like 30 pens in there. So we could have done that all day if I wouldn't have finally realized. I stood up, I saw the pens, I grabbed the bucket and moved it out of the way. But she subconsciously kept going and grabbing another one. So what I tell people is I know when we're starting out, some people feel more confident having 2 people in the interview whenever they're there. Again, interviewing somebody, sure, you can have 2 people in there. But when we're doing the full hard interviewing, the interrogation type stuff, it is easier to have 1 person in the room when you're feeling confident about what you're doing because you're still having barriers. When you've got 2 people, somebody's using ping pong. Their eyes are bouncing back and forth, going back and forth, reviewing that information that both people are giving them. We want to kind of keep them on a track of being focused on 1 interviewer. Is there times where you're going to have to change that up? Absolutely. Is it something you have to do? No. You can keep that physical barrier blocked by just keeping 1 person in there where they feel they're only talking to 1 person. When you put people in a room, try to keep things plain. We'll talk about this when it comes to room setup and room preparation. We don't want to have tons of stuff in the room where they're distracted. Folks, we don't need our advanced certificates. We don't need our 4-year degree certificates up there, our diplomas and all that. We don't need none of that up on the walls. That's just distracting for people. It gives them something to cut their eyes towards whenever we're trying to talk to them and we want them looking at us. Keep your walls as bare as you can. Keep your desk as bare as you can. We want to limit those distractions. So looking at this picture, as we look at it, and there's a video that's associated with it that you're going to watch or have already watched when it comes to this. If you look at the way when Bill Clinton's talking to the public about what occurred with him with Monica Lewinsky, you'll notice in these pictures, all 3 of these, his hand is pointing forward even though it's crooked a little bit, his hand's pointing forward while his eyes are reverting to a totally different part. Now, I don't know about y'all, but when I point my finger at something, I don't look away from it while I'm pointing it. If I'm talking to you and I say, hey, let me tell you something, I'm pointing at you and I'm looking at you. Compared to this, where we see the eyes are completely diverting away from the body. That is the body's internal struggle to tell the truth versus lie. That is the body saying, I don't want to lie. This is not a good thing for me to be doing. I'm getting ready to lie to millions of people. There's tons of people in this room. There's cameras all over the place. That is his body fighting itself. And it does not want to look at those cameras and tell people a lie. So it's fighting. So as you watch the video, when you watch the video, pull it up, you'll notice his eyes kind of bounce back and forth, but they don't really lock on for more than a split second somewhere, because again, with that finger, it's like telling somebody, telling your kids, telling a family member, pointing at them directly and saying, I'm going to tell you something and I want you to listen to me. And when we do that, usually we're looking at the person when we do it. So we talked about all this stuff when it comes to body language, but again, like I said, our body language matters as well. If we're showing closed off body language, they may as well. So what we're trying to do is prevent that. So we need to open up our body language in order to get people to talk to us. And there's this thing called mirroring. It's this alpha dominance of an interview. And what we do is we sit in an interview with somebody and we're talking to them and they've got their arms crossed. What I tell people is, you know what? It doesn't hurt to go ahead and cross your arms and sit there and talk to the person for a few minutes. And after a few minutes, open your stance up, maybe lean forward just a little bit, open that stance up. And if true alpha dominance has occurred in the room, if you are running the room is what I call it, like that is your room, they mentally know that you're in charge, you're going to see their body language shift a little bit too. And they're going to open up. And that's what we want. We want to get them into that state. Remember, like we started earlier with that confession time picture, we want to open them up into that state. This isn't something that happens right away, and sometimes it doesn't work. You'll open up and they'll sit still. That doesn't mean you need to run back to closing your arms up again to mirror that person. In other words, looking almost identical to what you're looking at with them, where they're looking at you with arms crossed, you're looking at them with arms crossed. Give it a few minutes, talk to them, keep talking about whatever you're talking about, and then cross your arms again and go back to that conversation. And then give it a few more minutes and try again. Doesn't always work, but we do see that from time to time. When we want people to open up their stance to us, they'll open their arms up when we open our arms up. And using our body language to get somebody to talk to us is a big part of what we do. The only way you're going to get good at something like mirroring is to practice it. So I recommend, once you're feeling confident in an interview, practice mirroring the individual and seeing if they will kind of come out of that state of defense if you can mirror their body language long enough and then open up your body language. All right, so we've covered body language so far. There's a couple of other things you're going to look at here when it comes to some videos and stuff that we want to look at that are very important. But body language is, again, one of those big things that we see on a regular basis. We see it from our friends. We see it from our spouses. We see it from kids. We see it from people that we work with. We see it in basic interviews, defensive stances when it comes to victims sometimes, those closed stances because they're nervous, they're scared. Again, we're not looking at deceptive behavior. We're looking at, it's not just truthful versus lying behavior. We're looking at open versus closed. So remember, when we're viewing open versus closed postures, not only is it about them, but it's about us too. What does our body language tell the person? The way we're sitting. Is the way we're sitting the way we shouldn't be sitting like that, because it doesn't give them the idea that we're trying to be open with them, or are we closed off? Or are we leaned up against a desk and we don't really look like we're really paying attention? It's extremely important that we set up that interview by having that open stance, just as it is for them to have an open stance with us. So when you're working on these things and you're learning these new things when you're out there, remember, it applies to you too. The way your face expresses emotion, the way your body expresses emotion, things like that. When somebody tells you something sad, our body language, if we're stiff, they're going to see that stiffness. And what we don't want to do is to show or make them think for a second that we don't have the empathy or the sympathy based on the situation to help them with what they're going through. Lying people need empathy just as much as truthful people do. Because again, some people lie about different things. Doesn't mean they're always going to be doing it for the wrong reasons, even though they may have, whatever they've done is wrong. Doesn't mean they had the intent to do it for a criminal reason. Maybe they had what they believed was a good reason. For instance, stealing to take care of another family member or something like that. So those are things we have to take into our mind, and some concepts we have to deal with when it comes to body language. With that said, if you have any questions, please reach out. Hopefully this has been a little bit of a eye-opener for what body language looks like when you're talking to people. But if you have anything at all out there, yep, just reach out to me.